І так, вітаю.
Okay, welcome everyone.
Вітаю вас на 7-й лекції від урбаністичної
Welcome to this lecture number 7 of the Urban Coalition ro3kvit, which this time is supported by the Vidrodzhina Renaissance International Foundations, and this is our 7th lecture this season. Today it focuses on sociology and community issues, but I guess that I'd better give the floor to my colleague. She will be more specific about that.
Hi everyone. I will continue in English. So welcome again. The 7th lecture in our ro3kvit series. It's a series that we are conducting from ro3kvit to inform. It has two reasons basically. One is to inform people who follow us on what we are doing, what kind of researches and projects. So over the course of time, there will be more and more outcomes from research. Tonight we are super happy to have some outcome from research being done currently at MIT. It's not completely finished yet. It's in a midterm stage, but I am very happy with our two speakers who will share that with us. I will introduce them shortly. Brent D. Ryan, first of all, well, your name is underneath, but hi Brent, great to have you. He's Associate Professor of Urban Design and Public Policies at the MIT, specialized in shrinking cities and de-industrialization. On top of that, climate change is rather on top of your agenda, let's say. Ryan also has been leading several research projects in Ukraine with architectural arts and planning collective called Urban Curators. For instance, a study in post-industrial Kyiv, of which we will hear a lot more now. Kateryna Lopatiuk is a Fulbright Visiting Scholar at the same university and MIT. She's also a member of the Ukrainian European Architectural Student Assembly, the EASA team. Her research focuses on bottom-up initiatives and urban morphologies. So the both of them will present a study on, as I say, with a focus on Kyiv. It's called Microrayon versus Market Modernism. I think it's a very nice term, the market modernism. You would expect the term capitalism being used a lot. We will see what comes out of it. But to make the opposite as a comparison and to see what comes out, the lecture will be in the end ending with some very practical recommendations actually to Ukraine on what to take into consideration when working on the reconstruction. So without much further ado, I will open the floor to the both of you. The lecture will be around half an hour, and audience, please keep an eye on the Q&A below to prepare your questions there. We will have over half an hour to discuss with them and to answer your questions. So please, the floor is yours. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Lila.
Can you please allow me to share the screen?
So I think Kateryna will share screen and we'll begin with our presentation. I'll provide a short introduction, and then Kateryna will speak about the study, introduction, methodology, results, and then I'll speak again toward the conclusion, and we'll be very happy to answer questions. Allow me to provide a bit of a context for this study, which is called Microrayon versus Market Modernism, where we compare morphologically Soviet-era microdistricts in Kyiv to modern residential complexes. Kateryna is the third of three Fulbright Fellows who've come to MIT as visiting scholars in the past 5 years. All three are members of ro3kvit. That's Anastasia Ponomarova, Yegor Vlasenko, and Kateryna Lopatiuk. And with each Fulbright scholar, we engage in a different area of study relating to transformations of the built environment in Ukraine and in Kyiv, particularly with respect to de-industrialization, but also with respect to the dramatic social and political shifts that have been occurring in Ukraine since independence in 1991. So our first study with Anastasia examined the transformation of industrial districts and was published in the Journal of Planning History in 2020, sorry. Second study with Yegor Vlasenko examined decommunization and the impact of decommunization legislation on the built environment of Kyiv, particularly with respect to monumental architectural complexes. That was published in the Journal of Urban History in 2021. This study, Microrayon versus Market Modernism, will also be published in a peer-reviewed international urban design journal. It's in the middle of its review process, so we expect publication within 6 months. And we'll be happy to share that reference when the study is finally published. Motivation for our study was twofold. First, we were interested in understanding better simply what was the urban morphology of the Soviet microrayon. Since the independence of Ukraine and the breakdown of the Soviet Union in 1990 and 1991, there's been a plethora of rich research that examines the microrayon from an architectural, heritage, and social perspective. But we were also interested in understanding the morphological dimensions of the microrayon in a quantitative sense, and Kateryna will speak more about that. Secondly, we were interested in better understanding this phenomenon of market modernism, which is the post-independence, high-density residential complexes built under capitalism in Ukraine, and with a particular concentration of them in Kyiv. And we found, surprising as it may seem, that very, very little literature had examined these in a comparative context. So we took the opportunity, beginning in early 2020, to compare several microrayon Soviet era and capitalist or market era complexes. I want to note a couple of provisos to this study, or qualifications, before Kateryna goes further. First, that this study was initiated not only before Russia's war against Ukraine, but it was also initiated before COVID. So this study has its origins in a kind of pre-COVID, pre-Russia war against Ukraine condition. But second, given that the landscape has changed so dramatically with Russia's war against Ukraine and the incredible and tragic destruction of Ukraine's built environment, we feel that this study actually provides a lot of relevance for the growing number of debates about how and why and when and where to rebuild Ukraine's built environment. A large number of the housing complexes that have been damaged in the war have been Soviet-era microrayons, although you'll notice in the press that they're never referred to in that way, because outside of Ukraine and outside of the ex-Soviet Union, these complexes are very seldom understood as a holistic planning concept. We want to provide a better illustration of this holistic planning concept, and in particular to point out the ways in which the Soviet microrayons succeeded and failed in terms of their morphological and social apparatus, and the way in which the market modernism complexes succeeded and failed. I want to provide a preview that the answer is not simple. There's no all good, all bad, one is perfect, one is terrible. The world of urbanism and the world of society is not that simple. We illustrate that these both eras of construction are complex, that both represent pluses and minuses. And those pluses and minuses, or positive and negative qualities, are worth reflecting on as we now consider this urgent need to reconstruct Ukraine. With that, I turn the floor over to Kateryna to introduce the specific study. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brent, and hello, everyone. I will start talking on this topic with a bit of a speculative picture. It is known that by market adaptation, like citizens, particularly in Kyiv, start prioritizing market modernist objects, and I will later explain why we use this specific term in opposed to the Soviet modernist areas like microrayons, residential planning units. But most of the main reason for that is not particularly morphological, but mostly the issue of maintenance. But we will also look in the specific parameters to identify how drastic the differences are, and what are the main reasons for this prioritization. For our study, we, as mentioned before, use the term market modernism. We use it to describe the market adaptation of modernist planning and design, which we apply to the complexes that were built in Kyiv after Ukraine gained independence in 1991. For the study, we examined 6 microrayons that are part of 2 big residential massives that are located on a left bank of the Dnieper River. Those specific examples, those specific areas were the part of expanding of Kyiv to the left bank of the Dnieper River. And to compare them to market modernism design approach, we investigate 2 contemporary residential complexes that you can see on the scheme. One is Comfort Town and another is Parkovaya Zara. Both residential complexes were chosen for the comparison due to their high appreciation in the media, especially Comfort Town. However, along with that, it is worth mentioning that Parkovaya Zara was an object of the prior research that was made by our co-author, Yegor Vlasenko, and also MIT Fulbright Fellow that Brent referred before. So most of people know that origins of microdistricts are coming from the modernist concepts of urban planning presented by Le Corbusier or Clarence Perry. However, it can also be traced in works by Friedrich Ebert, for example, in the neighborhood unit urban planning of the city of Harlov that he done. So the point here is that this concept of urban planning organization wasn't just something particularly Soviet, but it is deeply rooted in Western urban planning approach that was developing through ages. Talking about the specific cases, let's start with Rusanivka. This is a unique, as for Soviet times, object which was artificially created island for residential purposes on the former floodplains. The functional zoning of Rusanivka defined very specific location of the houses, and you can also, by the GIF that you have on the screen, you can also see how the approach into planning was changing. For example, starting from 70s, they added a new type of prefabricated housing that created some dominance in this built environment. The hardest part working with this context was identifying the particular typologies. Most of them have modifications, and you can also see on the scheme that lots of them just signed as a modification of some of the typologies. But we were lucky to find sources not only in amazing books by Philip Moiser on housing typologies, but also we founded an open source data website called ProMap. Unfortunately, it's not accessible anymore. However, it's stored. It's accessible as an archive on the website, but it stored the more specific information about each unit inside each of the microdistricts. Another prominent object and a representative of Soviet urban planning approach is Pivnichno-Borovsky Massif. It was also situated and built on uninhabited territory located on left bank of Dnieper River. Opposed to Rusanivsky microdistrict, the urban planning design is more regulated and repetitive within each of the microdistricts within the massif. However, it have very unique and experimental, as for Soviet times, features, like, for example, in this first block that you see on the bottom left, semicircular housing typology is also a modification of one. Let me know if you can hear me. I guess I have some problems with my headphones, and let me know if they will collapse. It's possible. I apologize.
Very well. We can hear you very well, Kateryna.
Thank you very much. It can happen, and then I will try to reconnect somehow. So important to say, which I forgot to mention on this slide, that for the study we had to identify for each block we defined a separate ID so that we could understand what object we are talking about and what calculations of what objects we are doing. I will be referring to that while explaining the measurements that we were doing for the comparison. So another about the Market Modernist complexes that we have chosen for the comparison. Those are actually objects that are both kind of immersed in a Soviet urban planning system. So these are not unique architectural urban units that expect some scalability, but they are located on the former industrial areas that dilapidated or collapsed after the industrialization process, starting from the moment when Ukraine gained its independence. So as you can see, Barkoville's era is situated on former machine building factory, and Comfort Town on the former rubber factory industrial area. To understand the difference, to be able to calculate them, we're looking at specific parameters that were presented in Brent Ryan's book, Whatever Happened to Urbanism. I would like to speak more about 8 specific parameters from them. Like you can see them on the left, like structure, type mix, dwelling unit mix, unit density, parcel coverage. There are also 4 parameters here that we abandoned. Land use mix we abandoned due to lack of open source data, like land use in Ukraine. It can be a harsh problem to identify that. And 2 parameters like block fixed mix and street intersections we abandoned due to inconsistency to Ukrainian context. We just found it irrelevant to the Soviet urban planning, for instance. Along with that, important thing to say why we're looking at these specific parameters, you can see that they were presented by researcher Emily Tallinn that referred here. and she was talking about these parameters as part of a diversity, which is actually a most important part of like to identify the quality of urban environment. On the right in the table, those are additional parameters that we managed to gain by identifying all the types of fabricated housing, so that we can do the further calculations. Such parameters are as total amount of buildings and total amount of units and building area. In addition to that, except of measures that we were doing to address the so-called or to define the urban score, we were also looking at the specific technical features, quantitative features of each of the site to define these features. We were using OpenStreetMap, using GIS and GeoPandas to calculate these measures. I've in each of the tables, I've highlighted the most specific ones so that you can pay attention to the most drastic differences between a Soviet urban planning typology and modern residential complexes. In particular, the amount of an open space could be one of the features that that you would pay attention on. So when calculating the 4 urban metrics presented by Tallinn in Brent's book, we decided we aggregated these numbers by specific calculations and then normalized so that we could calculate the total urban score. This score is actually speculative because it says if looking on total urban score, we could assume that modern residential complexes do not differ much from their Soviet predecessors. However, this is not true. First of all, due to that, in Tallinn's understanding, unit density is something positive. In our understanding, it's something different. Along with that, each specific parameter has absolutely drastic differences, which we are going to look more precisely further. To look precisely on that, we'll start with the structure mix. Structure mix helps us understand the percentage, to see the percentage between residential and non-residential functions within each of the cases. So the higher score you see in the table, the more non-residential elements are present within the residential block. And as you can see from the outcomes of this specific parameter, modern residential complexes, in particular, Comfort Town, almost doesn't dedicate any of inner space for other functions than residential. And we assume that this is due to the wish of developers to increase the profit to increase the profit, to increase the margin. The second important parameter for our calculations was the dwelling unit mix. This is also quite a speculative because we cannot, unfortunately, analyze the very initial ideas on with urban planning as we were analyzing current state of these areas, which means that for this actual dwelling unit mix, it compares the mixed use and the level of mixed use in this study cases. So what we've found out that all the cases show relatively similar level of mixed use inside of them. However, this is due to that, for example, in Rusanevsky, microrayons, they inserted commercial uses along the canal and the shore with the Dnipro on the left. That's why more of this mixed use appeared. However, in residential complexes, developers create vicinities including mixed uses just to follow the like commercial need and need of upper middle class customer. So another parameter that shows I can hear that my headphones are dying. Another parameter that shows the drastic difference is average parcel coverage. Here we see that how normatives on the land coverage changed from Soviet approach to recent one, because and it also can be seen in urban scores that we've calculated, that a comfort town almost covers the whole area of the plot without providing, almost not providing any common space, which in reality is occupied by open parking lots. But in terms of normatives, in Soviet times, there was a limit of 17% of the lot coverage by structures, and nowadays it can be up to 45, which is a drastic difference in approaches to urban planning. The main parameter which shows the this transit, that market-driven transit between two urban planning approaches, is unit density, except of the lot coverage, which we could see in Comfort Town residential complex, and both in Comfort Town and Parkovaya Zara. Surprisingly, we see that Parkovaya Zara, covering the 3 times less territory, shows the higher density, and it's all due to the high-rise structures. So here we can see that all the normatives of Soviet times referring to the distance between the housing or the of the side of the housing were neglected or abandoned, and that's another transit in a normative base, that in a regulative base, that actually help developers to increase the margin profit from the new developments. And then the last parameter, almost the last parameter that we are looking at in this comparison is the presence of social and civic facilities. You wouldn't see much difference in that. For example, in each of microrayons, you can see schools and kindergartens available within the walking distance. What new developments do is that they kind of inherit this approach. So in both cases, even in very densified and high-rise comfort Parkovaya Zara complex, they still have school, and yeah, probably only school within the area. However, they also dedicated some place for parking building, which wasn't present at Soviet planning at all. For example, along with that, Comfort Town also inherited an approach of having social facilities within the area, but also provided at least 3 spots for parking buildings, which wasn't present in Soviet times, and could and cannot currently meet the needs of middle upper class. The last and not least, but very important thing to mention is that to mention and explain why we appreciate modernist urban planning approaches heritage is that at that times the urban accents in the urban environment were prioritized both by policy and by just an architectural planning approach. It was a matter of aesthetics to identify these urban accents in the environment, and it was crucial for any development of the times. What we see nowadays happens that behind these colorful facades and higher ceilings or bigger windows, these houses, by their gatedness, these typologies of urban planning, they kind of neglected, and they also abandoned the concepts of creating some urban accents, trying to stand out mostly by the density and by the colorfulness. At some point, it creates cheeriness in comparison with Soviet prefabricated housing, which is dilapidating and aging. But along with that, that is something that we find is necessary to be preserved and to be taken into consideration in future planning and developments, especially the matter of scalability. For instance, in these cases, these residential complexes are gated, which doesn't provide any possible scalability or development further. This is just like immersed into the Soviet era urban structure development. Brent, next word to you, I guess.
Thank you, Kateryna, for that very clear and detailed exploration of the cases, the method, the background, and the findings of our study. As we move toward a conclusion, let's just think about a couple of the findings that we identified and the way in which we've interpreted those findings. We initially asked, is there conformance or deviation between the Soviet Microrayon model and the Market Modernism model? What we find is that there is some conformance, but also a substantial amount of deviation, and Kateryna began to discuss that. Obviously, we know that both developments are mostly high-rise, and that there are some facilities besides apartments found in both of those types of developments. And of course, both of them convey a certain social acceptance of high-rise, or at least comparatively high-rise living. But I think, as we'll explore, they're actually designated for very different publics. And that says a lot about the new urban realm that is being created, at least in pre-Russian war against Ukraine conditions. In terms of deviation, we found actually, despite some superficial similarities, that there are substantial differences between what was built, say, in Kyiv in the 1970s and what was built in Kyiv in the 2000s and 2010s. The Soviet microrayons are much lower density. They have a variety of civic facilities contained within them. They also contain a lot of what Karen Frank of the New Jersey Institute of Technology has called loose space. There's a lot of flexible space within these complexes, and in part that's how they've allowed the construction of these later Market Modernism complexes, because of the amount of additional space contained within them. Parking is not strongly considered. Oh, can we go back? There we go. Parking is not strongly considered. And the Soviet microrayon was considered for an overall public, right? The socialist public, where income and status were not supposed to exist. But today it's hard for them to meet the upper middle class's demand, because the apartments are small, because the condition of these apartments has declined over time. The Market Modernism complexes differ in all of the ways that I've just explained, and that we've explained in our findings. They're dense. They don't provide much to the general public or even to their inhabitants beyond an apartment unit. Instead of being open, they're closed. They convey a sense of an enclave rather than the sense of a public realm. car ownership is much higher, and accordingly, they're much more American in that they dedicate a lot of land to parking. Instead of looking out the window at a park, as you might in a microrayon, you're looking out the window at parking from these market modernism complexes, and you're paying a lot more for that privilege. In a sense, from the urban planning perspective, they offer much less. Although from the perspective of the apartment interior, and we know that the way capitalism markets residential spaces, people look at superficialities like kitchen finishes, the size of the bathroom. They don't look at things like civic facility, accessibility to transit, the location of the nearest playground. But in a superficial sense, at least, they meet the demand for middle-class buyers according to the conditions that middle-class buyers, in a sense, have been taught by capitalism to expect: the kitchen finishes and the new interiors. Next slide, please. Overall, we can see then that there are advantages and disadvantages to both. I think it's worth emphasizing the advantage of the Soviet microrayon, especially in an era when it seems like the institutional sector and certainly the developer sector is no longer able to construct these complexes. What did they provide? They provided open space. They provided civic facilities of a great amount of diversity to all social groups. They were in large part walkable, at least internally, and if they were connected to transit, they were walkable in a greater sense. And they were part of a larger urban ensemble. Market modernism provides comfort. The buildings are at a higher standard. Quote unquote security is better provided for, although security is to some extent a subjective concept. Better community services in the sense that everything is new, although it may not be larger or more convenient or more accessible. And the amenities are all inside rather than outside. We're familiar with the disadvantages, but let's emphasize again the disadvantages of the new market modernism complexes. First and foremost, we observe that in a sense, they're parasitizing. These are parasites in a way upon larger public amenities. They don't provide any public amenities themselves, but they take advantage of the substantial public amenities around them. I think you can see that Parkowie Ozera is surrounded by a gigantic park that was built during the Soviet Union. It's taking advantage of that park, but it provides nothing in return. These developments, of course, are not inclusive. They're only affordable to those who can obtain those advantages through money, nor are they necessarily scalable. That's not necessarily the fault of the developer, but the developer is building on infill sites. We also observe that they don't offer a sustainable strategy for city development. What happens when Kyiv and other Ukrainian cities run out of these industrial infill sites located within much more spatially generous microrayons? When those complexes when those industrial facilities have all been consumed, demolished presumably, and replaced by high density, low amenity residential complexes, developers are going to have to start building at the periphery of the existing built up area of Kyiv. This is going to mean they're going to start consuming greenbelt. And if they continue in this same model of development, they're going to be building very dense complexes that provide absolutely no park space and very few civic amenities. So we're going to start to see the development of a very, very high density and low amenity built environment at the periphery of Ukrainian cities once these infill sites have been taken up. In a sense, then, these market modernist complexes, this is the absolute best we're going to ever see because the developers took the best sites first. From now on, the sites will be of lower quality and the collective public benefit of these complexes will continue to decrease. Next slide, please. So in our conclusion, we found a lot of competitive advantages to the urban planning model of the microrayon. And we found, in a sense, that the urban advantages of the microrayon are irreplaceable. We found, in other words, that the microrayon has a set of advantages that should absolutely be preserved and upgraded at all costs. These are not facilities to demolish and to replace unthinkingly with private sector-led housing, because we're going to see the very same phenomena occurring that we found in these market modernism complexes of a lack of public amenity, a lack of public access, and high density space. We don't think that the market-driven higher density developments, on the other hand, can address the social demands and social needs of the Ukrainian public. We believe microrayons should be rehabilitated. They have a lot of value, but we also know that there's a lot of room for improvement in the improvement of these microrayons, and that there are substantial existing challenges first and foremost, the horrific demolition and destruction that has occurred as a result of the Russian war against Ukraine. So I think in tandem with many of our colleagues, both in ro3kvit and elsewhere, we believe that the substantial challenge is both to generate a policy system that can assist in the upgrading and the sustainability of the microrayons, akin to that is happening across the European Union, especially in Eastern Europe, but also in the adaptation of regulatory and policy-making measures to enforce the provision of additional public amenities in the private developer-led system of residential development in Kyiv and in Ukraine. Thank you. And I now, for our final word, turn the floor back over to Kateryna. Thank you very much.
Let me know if you can hear me. I don't know in which headphone is the microphone. I apologize for that again. Okay, so we would like to end our presentation on, as Brent just said, that the most important changes have to happen in the policy. And we would like to refer to the research that was done by Ukrainian Analytical Center SEDAS. They did the research, and in this specific article, they mention several of the most crucial theses on the new housing policy that had to happen, that have to develop after we're gonna win this war. We were not talking specifically on we were not comparing the issues of safety of houses, as we mentioned before that our research was done prior the war started, but we still feel that while still 3/4 of all the population of Ukraine live in Soviet era residential urban housing, residential houses. We see that approach to deal with this heritage has to be our thought. Yeah, that's why we highly recommend to follow the QR code and see what SEDAS suggests as ways to improve the housing policy in Ukraine. The last word would be that this presentation that we made is just a tiny piece of all the study that we conducted together with Brent and Yegor Vlasenko, and now it is on revision stage, but will sooner or later be published in the Journal of Urban Design, and you're welcome to read it more precisely later and get familiar with all the calculations and comparison in more detail. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much. This was so rich in information in a short period of time, and definitely makes us want more, eat more. So get out this publication super fast, because I think a lot of people will need it in the very near future. So thanks a lot for that. Let us repeat the possibility of putting your questions or remarks in the Q&A. You can also just raise your hand and we can, it's called upgrade you to become a panelist. And you can put your question yourself in person on the screen, which is much more personal than this strange anonymous way of conversation that we have to have with the audience in this Zoom environments. Getting used to it through COVID, and now it became handy as well. So let's also embrace it, the possibility. I would like to kick off with one question, and that I'm sure it's me who didn't understand it well. It has to do with density. It's quite clear what you described and how you favor the microrayons in a lot of ways. But when you described, I think it was in your conclusion, Brent, when you described the higher density of the new developments, and from that, how, if they would demolish the microrayons, would still have to build further on the outskirts. But I didn't get that in terms of density, because I think if they are more dense, and they would replace the microrayons, then they would be able to house more people. So that's the first question. And related to that, is there an increase of population foreseen in the areas at stake?
Kateryna, should I answer Lilith's question briefly, and you can also reply? Right, so there is sorry, I wasn't clear there. I think we can envision two scenarios. I think the first is probably pretty undesirable for multiple reasons. This would be where existing microrayons are replaced, essentially demolished, and replaced with higher density dwellings. Obviously, the concern there is not only in the quality of the built environment that would replace them, but in the almost guaranteed displacement of whoever would be living in these previously living in these microrayons. And that is obviously the huge unanswered question that happens in any case of housing redevelopment. I am not confident that the existing system can fairly provide for the rehousing, the fair rehousing of the households that are living in existing microrayons. And I would suspect that most households in the microrayons would say, I would rather keep the existing building and all of the disadvantages that come along with that, rather than be kicked out and moved to whatever the developer thinks I deserve, which could be housing at the periphery or something like that. We see this happening in every case of redevelopment. China has been most notorious in this displacement of millions, essentially to enrich the real estate industry. And we should add the pockets of government officials, which is, not an ideal part of this process. In a second scenario, if existing microrayons are to be preserved, we'll find that large-scale private developments will, in fact, start to run out of space. No city has endless amount of space for large-scale private developments. Typically, as we know, in the post-industrial or transitioning late 20th century, early 21st century city, and this is a global condition, these sites are typically industrial sites. This is everywhere from India to Boston to Ukraine, that these large industrial facilities have become obsolete. Developers can take them over and rebuild them. Not only is there some heritage value to those industrial facilities that we think, I've argued in other research with Anastasia, should be appreciated, but there's only a certain number of them. So there's no endless inventory of land. So developers will move to the periphery of the city. What's at the periphery of Kyiv? Ideally, there's a green belt there, also created in Soviet times to, in a sense, provide for near-in recreational space for the citizens of Kyiv. That green belt will begin to erode, very similar to the condition in London, where there's enormous market pressure on the green belt, and every green belt that's been created eventually runs into this problem. But the warning that we find in our research is that developers, if they continue to build this market modernism model, are going to begin constructing a dense carpet of high-rise developments with very, very little civic space or open space. And we're going to start to see a progressive degradation of the collective built environment as a result. Thank you. Kateryna, over to you.
There's actually not much to add, but there was I don't remember the law on reconstruction or rebuilding or demolition, preservation of urban Soviet heritage. It was active. It's active from 2008, but according to the law, all 100% of citizens living in specific prefabricated house have to agree on its demolition and being replaced to other location. And this is one of the hardest things to agree upon or to negotiate. That's why this law literally doesn't work. And that is only one of the main reasons why it is very hard to work with this type of urban planning heritage, residential heritage.
Yeah, quite clear.
It's an anti-displacement measure, in other words.
Yeah. We have a question in the Q&A. You can also ask it yourself, Philippe. Do you want that, or shall I just read it? I guess I read it out. So Philippe Antipenko is asking the question: are you sure that market modernism is a correct term to describe all the contemporary mass housing developments in Kyiv? For example, the Comfort Town is more of a postmodern example of urban design development.
That's a literature-related question, and I think the term market modernism was simply identified from previous literature that examined this identical phenomenon. We used it as much for the case of consistency rather than attempting to prove that everything was exactly modern or postmodern. I agree. I think we can debate the exact stylistic nature of these complexes, but the term market modernism appeared to be not only a memorable, but I think to some extent broadly used in the literature term to describe these really post-independence large-scale residential complexes. And so we simply borrowed it in the sense for convenience's sake. Maybe Kateryna has something to add to that idea.
I can also add that this term has been used to describe the transit within two approaches. And as we were talking about some similar features, we looked at it from the perspective of just types of developments, lessly or mostly irrelevant to the period of their development. We related to the normatives that were present at different times, but along with that, we use specifically on morphology, like on physical characteristics of this environment.
Okay, hopefully that answered your question, Leap. Are there more from the audience coming in? Yes, Kyle. Well, it is in a question in English, but I think Margot, can you read the question?
Okay, I have a, sorry, I need to switch channel. Okay, I have a question based on Brent's summary, but it may be better to address it to Kateryna as a native Ukrainian. Brent mentions that Ukrainian construction norms and regulations need improvement. Kateryna, how do you see that happening, and how optimistic will you be about it happening?
Well, it's also hard to answer questions due to that these regulations that need to be changed needs to be very specified and specifically addressed. At the end of the presentation, we referred to the very broad research done by SEDAS Analytical Center. They mention, if I'm not mistaken, about 37 points in what could be changed in regulatory mechanisms in Ukraine in terms of new development, construction, and Soviet heritage preservation. The only thing I would say in terms of me as a Ukrainian, as you address, that I see it's very important to find the possible ways and regulations and methods to preserve, at least overthink, the Soviet heritage that we have, because we cannot abandon 60% of like demolish 60% of Ukrainian territory, getting rid of this heritage. And we should definitely come up with a way to improve this environment and to make it more livable. That's my answer.
Anything to add, Brent, to this?
I would say that I agree. I think the establishment of stronger institutional norms is an ongoing one, and of course, planning can't happen without the enforcement of institutional norms. So I think this would be a great a national agenda for Ukraine to undertake in concert with the European Union, for example, which is so experienced in institutional norms that enforce progressive planning regulations. But I think more broadly, I think we want to emphasize that the Microrayon, in a sense, it's now an artifact from the past, but it's also a gift. It's a gift from the past. It's a generous public realm. It's well planned. It provides a variety of civic facilities. It's often located convenient to infrastructure. And where it's not convenient to infrastructure, additional mass transit infrastructure can be built to make it more convenient. For example, in the Troyeshny area of Kyiv, where an envisioned metro was never constructed, the construction of additional infrastructure can improve the accessibility of these complexes further. This is not a building arrangement to be thrown away, because as we've seen, it's not at all easy to reproduce in the current day. So let's think carefully about the ways in which we can fortify the buildings of the Microrayon to make them more structurally sound, to make them more accessible, to keep them in working order into the future, and how to keep that very, very generous and wonderful public realm that in a sense is unique to the Microrayon intact for future generations that live in Ukrainian cities.
I would also like to add that in our research, we didn't address the citizens' assessment towards these particular built environments, which means that while further developing or developing other norms or regulations for like urban improvement, we should also find participatory mechanisms so that we could address people's assessment of these types of environment, not just create this environment without any negotiation whether it is the better or a worse solution.
Absolutely. And I think, Kateryna, this is some of the work that you'll undertake when you return to Ukraine. At least I hope so.
Yeah, thank you for that. That was exactly my question. Did you already, or are you planning to take that into consideration and make new schemes for that?
You are talking about the research on participatory mechanisms?
Yeah. And the question basically to how people react, and if you already have a hunch there or data from it.
Unfortunately, that wasn't a part of our investigation. We were taking into consideration qualitative measures as well, but these are open source qualitative measures like open data. However, I think that would be an important and additional part to investigation, and it actually could become a separate research study, as it's like can be done in a much broader way, not limited with the approach of our specific study that we make.
I see a hand raised. Margaret?
Так, я маю до вас питання. Нещодавно
Yes, I have a question. Several of our decision makers said that recently that we needed new residential development and new types of generating this residential development. So what is your opinion? What kind of new trends can there be in this residential development?
Kate, do you want to take that question first?
I asked you first.
Well, I think in a sense, the answer is right before our eyes. So again, our paper will be very helpful, I think, to decision makers that are making arguments for the construction of new residential complexes. Take a look at the existing Microrayon and take a look at the advantages provided by that. In essence, if you could somehow incentivize a developer to create a new Microrayon at the levels of density and public amenity and open space and lack of obsession with the car and provision of public transport, diversity of public facilities, but with improved building stock and let's say unit arrangements that meet contemporary needs. My personal opinion is that you would have solved the housing question for Ukraine. I actually think that the Microrayon, and this is my personal opinion, is a wonderful solution for residential housing around the world. I think countries like Singapore that have taken this model, in a sense, hybridizing, although Singapore would never admit this, they've hybridized British new town planning with Soviet era high-rise development. They've created a very, very successful, and I should note, sustainable, pleasant way to live, convenient way to live, very secure way to live for the entire population of the country. So I personally feel that there's a lot to learn from the Microrayon, with maybe some improvements to the individual building that obviously include energy efficiency, accessibility, and as I said before, the unit arrangements needed for contemporary living. Otherwise, I actually, and again, I'm speaking personally, and Kateryna can disagree, I think, but you look empirically at our paper, the Microrayon provides a very wide variety of successful amenities for living. Thank you. Kateryna, any, do you agree or disagree with my statement?
Mine, I have less of successful examples of rehabilitation of less of experience or knowledge of the successful examples of rehabilitation of modernist urban planning heritage, but in most regard, I would agree on that. At least I believe that it's much harder to address the issue, for example, of all this housing unit being privatized, and how do you come up with a way to inhabit people with the different type of mass housing. I mean, I believe it just can be rehabilitated instead.
Okay, we have two more questions. One from Alice Alexandrova. Do you have any plans of adjusting the results of the research to the new input of war conditions? I think you tapped into that a little bit, but very specifically, the question is, for example, the disadvantage of the panel microrayons now include low performance in explosion resistance, so safety, and the centralized heating that is working on full capacity, even though some microrayons have less than half of pre-war amount of residents. So the energy question, the safety question, did you think of updating the results in terms of those new conditions?
I can answer briefly. In a sense, the easy answer is no, simply because this is a publication that's already, in a sense, partway through the publication process. We may, and again, and I should note that Yegor Vlasenko and I did this in our previous paper. We added a postscript to the paper that said, the Russian war against Ukraine has changed conditions for decommunization. We know that there's additional removal of Soviet-era iconography and war-related iconography as a result of Russia's war against Ukraine. We will speak when our article is finally accepted. We'll speak to the journal and see if we can add a short postscript. I think that's necessary and valuable. With respect to the defensibility of the Microrayon, unfortunately, I'm not sure that any built environment is bombardment proof. Certainly, the single-family house is not bombardment proof either, and I'm not sure that I would attempt to make defensibility a leading design variable for housing in the future, although there may be a variety of opinions on that. I think the other issue you raised is one that absolutely should be addressed, which is the issue of population decline. So Ukraine, as we know, pre-COVID, pre-Russian war against Ukraine, was a demographically declining country. It's likely to continue to be. And in many areas, especially outside of the capital, cities have been experiencing declining populations. So again, there are a lot of examples from Eastern Europe, particularly in Eastern Germany, of a kind of structured diminution or removal of upper floors of microrayon dwellings to produce smaller dwellings, keeping all of the inhabitants that live there and giving them equivalent units downstairs that were empty. Some strategy like that could be certainly instituted, and there are many best practices available from the European Union to match panel housing with a smaller population. Thank you. Kateryna?
Well, I don't know what else to add to that actually. There is a related question, as I can see, from Yegor Vlasenko. Maybe he wants to address it himself, as he one of the co-authors of the paper.
Yeah, I thought so too. It would be good. Yegor, I kind of, yes, please. You were mentioned already a couple of times as one of the other fellows, so it would be nice to, if you can address it yourself.
Oh yeah, thanks for the possibility. My question is actually more like as an attendant. Yeah, I was thinking that, do you think with this succession or deviation debate, it would be also productive to look into construction technology and perhaps planning as a process, as in administration and also technical process? So that was the first question I was thinking about. And then the second one, you had this wonderful visualization of expansion of modernist sites in time. So I was wondering if you have looked at the same expansion in Market Modernist site, and if so, what these patterns can reveal. Thank you.
I will start with the second question. I had in mind providing the video like that also shows the expansion of modern residential complexes. I didn't do that. However, it is known that prefabricated housing was much faster in terms of construction and was addressing rapid questions of rapid industrialization and inhabiting of people who were working on these industrial sites. We do not have these challenges anymore. However, with Russian aggression, new challenges of inhabiting people who were internally displaced arises. That's why in terms of construction, it would be interesting to see, to at least measure how fast it happens, like how they use what technologies are used, and compare them in terms of efficiency and affordability as well. However, I would also say that for example, the technique of prefabricating housing gained a new appreciation in the media, and there are a lot of modern sites, construction sites. I have in mind some specific ones in Finland, for example, of this type of prefabricated panel housing, which also proves to be very economically efficient. And the thing is that materials and the specific joints and this approach has been changed and improved, but it's much more economically efficient than other types of construction. That, of course, could be investigated in more detail and taken into consideration too.
Does that answer your question, Yegor, or Brent, do you have anything to add?
Thank you.
Okay, great. Then I think we are slowly about to wrap up this session. But just before, in the pre-talk to this session, we learned that both our speakers are rushing off directly after this to quite important meeting in terms of the topic we are talking about and the work that ro3kvit is doing. So maybe Kateryna, you can explain and ask our panelist or our audience to give you some questions maybe that you can address in half an hour from now.
Yes. To let you know, these days, today and tomorrow at MIT, there will be a city science summit happening. Half of today's presentation will be dedicated to rehabilitation and rebuilding of Kharkiv city. Norman Foster Foundation and Norman Foster himself, along with the mayor of Kharkiv, gonna be present on this event. Tomorrow, they're also going to be leading a workshop dedicated to rehabilitation of Kharkiv. And my question was, I ask you or welcome you to address any questions you would like to address to Norman Foster himself or Norman Foundation in terms of rehabilitation of Kharkiv. If you have any concerns on this matter, I'll be happy to forward them. Along with that, I will definitely make some report from the summit after I visit it.
Will it be live streamed, Kateryna? This City Science Summit, or is this an invitation only event?
I think it's an invitational. However, I will check on the webpage if it's going to be streamed, at least today's presentation, but probably not. I didn't see they were mentioning it anywhere.
Okay, then we're trusting your reporting.
That's right. Take good notes.
Sure, of course.
So any poignant question that we should ask, or just wait the ideas that they come up with? I don't see a lot happening at the moment. So interesting. Keep us updated for sure to what has been said there and what the plans are, and how we might be able to influence them maybe at some point, or join forces, or be part of the discussion. I think that is very important for ro3kvit to be part of the discussion, not just amongst ourselves, but also with other people who are working basically towards the same goal, and that is to get Ukraine back, let's say. Let's close it off for today. I don't know, Marco, do you have anything to add? maybe you want to address the honors a little bit. Let me close off for myself by thank you both so much for these very insightful presentations and short discussion. And we're surely looking forward, of course, to the full publication of all your work you are doing. And of course, we are in and will be in touch. We know how to find you. Margot, word is yours.
Thank you, Lila. We appreciate the
Тоді ми
opportunity to
завершимо.
present.
Okay, thank you very much. So we will be finishing then for today. And well, so we are waiting, we are looking forward to your report and Kateryna, and then well, follow us on Instagram and at our website and follow our events, and you're all welcome.
And thank you very much, Brent, well, for collaborating and for working together.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.
Goodbye.